Well, we've got a very exciting subject to talk to you about tonight, and only 2 hours. You know, I always get going on trees and slides and talking about interesting things, but our topic here is water and energy efficient tree choices. So that's kind of broken out into two categories. We're going to talk about water efficient choices first, with some basic background on water needs in trees, and then a number of trees that we consider some of our best in terms of their low water use. So I'll be showing you some pictures of a number of trees that I think are really the best xeric, coming from xeriscape, good xeric trees to use in your landscapes. And so we'll go over that. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll shift into the energy part of it and give you some information for where's the best site of your house to plant a shade tree to conserve energy, and give you some information there. And also, if you have solar panels, you may be thinking, well, I don't want any big trees, and we'll end up with a few of the real low maturing height trees that you can consider for planting near solar panels. And I do have some oaks to give away. We'll do that at the break. I'll give you a little more information on them right before the break that we take at 8 there. And I'm donating those. Some of you might know from previous presentations that one of my passions is to grow plants as well, which I do in my backyard. And I have a number of oaks that I'm growing. So I have a very xeric type oak here. I've got 4 of them. And I hope there's 4 volunteers who will take some of my oaks and plant them, and you can further evaluate those. So this is a good slide to start out with. This is not in Colorado, but it's near Colorado. It's over in Nebraska near McCook. It's Burr Oak Canyon, and we've got Burr oak trees growing naturally on native precipitation, about 20 inches of annual precip over there. Burr oak is not a native of Colorado, but it shows you those tough xeric trees that we need to be looking at when we're making tree choices. This is a picture from Colorado, and I bet there's probably none of you have seen this. This is down in southeast Colorado in Cottonwood Creek Canyon near the Black Mesa area, about 10 miles north of where New Mexico and Oklahoma and Colorado touch. If you go north there's the Mesa region there, and this is a area I particularly like. You see a lot of oaks growing down there on the creek, and then a lot of the shrub oaks and juniper up on the hillside. But you know, trees are adapted to the environment where they are native from. So we're talking about horticulture tonight, taking trees and planting them in an urban environment. But we need to know if it's a Burr oak, or it's a Gambel oak, or if it's a honey locust, where it came from, because that tells you a lot in terms of its adaptability to our area, the soils and the water requirements. This particular area has some very large oaks that have Burr oak in them, probably some post oak, Gambel oak. They have native hybrid origin, and this is one of the areas I've collected seeds and grown some of the trees that are very xeric. So if you know the seed sources of where trees come from or where they originate from, it tells you a lot in terms of their adaptability to our harsh climate here in Fort Collins. So, you know, we know that if you've lived here for any period of time, that it's a dry climate. It's semi-arid with only about 15 inches of annual precipitation a year. It's classified as a short grass prairie, and though there's a lot of exotic grasses in this picture, that does give you a general look of what Fort Collins area would have looked like pre-settlement. Shrubs, grasses. In the distance you can see some cottonwoods growing kind of in a row. If you'll focus on that slide a little bit and look in the distance, and there's 3 or 4 all kind of in a row. And very likely that's an irrigation lateral there, and those cottonwoods were growing there because there's water. Okay, so water is what makes the difference on whether it's a grassland or a forest. So we're trying to make a forest out of a grassland, but we want to be making really wise choices and picking the most adaptable trees because we want them to live. We don't want to put unnecessary inputs of insect and disease control, water, maintenance, pruning, premature removal and replacement. We want to make a good choice that is as sustainable as possible. So knowing about where they came from and their environment is important. And we know in Colorado there's lots of changes in elevation, and with that comes different vegetation types. This is a picture taken up on Rabbit Ears Pass, which is very different than we have here in Fort Collins. A lot more precipitation, mostly by snowfall. So you see the aspens, a type of native mountain ash here, and scrub oak growing. So when we start talking about native plants of Colorado, there's a lot of plant ecological zones. We have the prairie and the foothills and the montane and the subalpine and a lot of different areas. So when we're making plant choices, depending on where we live or taking plants from different parts of the state, they may or may not be adaptable to where we take them. So this particular little mountain ash is more of a shrub and does really well with a lot of snowfall and acidic soils and cool temperatures, but wouldn't do nearly as well in hot Fort Collins. So just looking at some data in terms of the average annual precipitation that we receive here in Fort Collins, and I picked some other sites too, and what I tried to do was, of course, have Fort Collins, but then also have some higher elevation sites as you move up higher. And you can see when you look at Monument, Estes Park, and Wolf Creek Pass, higher elevations, the precipitation rates go up. The temperatures also drop, so when you're growing vegetation at those zones, you're not going to have to irrigate as much because you get more natural precipitation and less evaporation because it's cooler. And then you're wondering, why did he have Manhattan, Kansas in there? But we often have to look east to where some of the broadleaf trees, and we refer to those as hardwood trees, grow, because those are a lot of the species that we're selecting to grow here, like Kentucky coffee tree and catalpa and bur oak. And to give you a little background, how much rainfall do they need to grow and survive without supplemental irrigation? And if we know that, then we have some information that would help us to know how much we have to irrigate them. So Manhattan, Kansas. Anybody from Kansas here this evening? Oh, I see a hand there, okay. So when you're making that drive across eastern Colorado and into Kansas and Nebraska, and I hear sometimes people say, well, that's a terrible drive and it's boring. I love it. You say, why does Tim love it? Because I see this ecological change as I'm going east, as it gets wetter and you get to the eastern border of Colorado and you have maybe 17, 18 inches of annual precipitation, and you get over a couple hundred miles into Kansas and you're up to 20, and then 22 and 25, and then over at Manhattan, 31, and you see this forest bit by bit getting more dense and more substantial, or if you're coming the other way, it's diminishing. So I see this ecological pattern of broadleaf trees that start in way western Kansas, and then they become more dominant and more species join the mix as you get over in that area. But if we look over into eastern Nebraska and Kansas, that's where a lot of these broadleaf trees grow. So they're getting 31 inches of precipitation. We're getting 15. It's about at the same latitude. So what would it take for us to grow a lot of those hardwood species? Well, you have to look at how hot it is in the summer and humidity. But you can just do the subtraction here and see that if we had about another 15 inches of moisture naturally or by supplemental irrigation, we're going to be okay. Growing a lot of the ash and chinkapin oak and bur oak and honey locust and all that. Can probably be even a little leaner than that, even at 25 inches of annual precipitation or 15 plus 10 natural precipitation. So you kind of see where I'm going with this slide. As we start talking about those species that are xeric in our area, they're not here for a reason. It's too dry. How much irrigation do they need? They need a little bit more, but maybe we're giving them a lot more than they need in some cases, and we'll talk more about that. So here's a topographic map of the United States and choosing trees adapted to our area. So we look at around the country. We have some good native species and native to Colorado that we'll talk about tonight that we should be planting, with ponderosa pine and bristlecone pine and southwest white pine. But our urban forest is going to be comprised and is of a lot of trees that are not native to Colorado. So when we start making that decision of choosing an adapted tree for Colorado, it's not always going to be native. Now, we get into these discussions on native plants, and it's it's a very good thing to be talking about using native plants for various reasons. They are closer to where we live, so they should be adapted. They also are less apt to escape into the wild or cause any kind of exotic nuisance problems. But when I get into discussions too, I have to always say that the boundaries of Colorado have no botanical meaning at all that I know of. And I'm a native of Colorado, and taking Colorado history, nobody ever said they made Colorado the shape it is because of botanical reasons. So if we say native to Colorado, those are geopolitical boundaries. And so it could have been bigger or smaller, but we need to look really at plants that are adapted here. They could come from western Nebraska or Kansas, or the Black Hills, or parts of New Mexico, or even other parts of the world that have a similar climate. We should look first to our native plants, but we know we're going to be growing non-natives, and so we looked even different parts of the world there. So when you look at a map like this, though this is a topographic map, the lines almost coincide with vegetation patterns. So you see Colorado up there, and so you see this line that really demarcates the high plains, and that's about where a lot of these broadleaf trees give out, okay, because it's getting too dry. So when we start looking for a species or a seed source that we want to grow trees from, the best place to look, if you were sent on a mission to go get you some acorns or go get you some seeds from a part of the country that isn't native of Colorado but has the best chance of surviving in Colorado, I would be looking right up in this area, right in here. Something that's far north and as far west as they come. And that's what a lot of urban foresters and nursery professionals are doing that are trying to select adapted trees, is looking at those dry areas as far west as some of those species come. Now here's just an example of a couple of species, bur oak and hackberry. Both of those are good urban trees for us and have good xeric qualities, and they grow all through the eastern United States. Well, I'm a tree guy, so I kind of the equivalent of a bird watcher. So I drive around and look at all these remote locations of trees and collect seed and take pictures and all that, and try to grow them. But I visited both of these locations. Here's this little group of bur oaks here in Bur Oak Canyon near McCook, Nebraska. Here's up in the Pine Ridge area, this really nice hackberry. That's a beautiful tree, isn't it? Very beautiful. Growing up in a pretty tough climate, a little bit wetter than here, about 18 inches of annual precip, a little bit colder. The bur oak gets about 20 inches of annual precip. Bingo. Those would be excellent seed sources to grow trees to be adapted to the Fort Collins area. So you're thinking, boy, that's really good, but I'm a homeowner and I'm not going to drive up there necessarily collect seed. But a lot of nurseries are starting to pay a lot more attention to where the seed sources of trees come from. And as you're a consumer, when you're on a nursery lot, a really good thing to ask them is, what is the seed source of this oak? Or what is the seed source of this Kentucky coffee tree? And they may pause a little bit. Hopefully they give you a good answer. It would be a good sign that they knew a lot about what they were growing. And if they told you that it was a more western source, that would be some really key information. But I like this, isn't that? Here's a broadleaf tree right out on the prairie tough, not growing on any supplemental irrigation, very sustainable, a little bit drier in Fort Collins, but a tree like that we can grow without a lot of inputs. So we're going to look at some species that we consider low water use, or in some cases you might even call them very low water use. And when irrigation is strategically applied, these species can be grown with less than 10 inches of supplemental irrigation per season. And I say with less than, some of these will really be, there's a few in here you can water and walk away from. That's pretty good, isn't it? If you can water it, get it established, and never water it again. I'd volunteer to have a few of those, particularly to save on water cost. Not all of these I show you are in that category, but 10 inches of supplemental irrigation a year. Think back to that 15 inches of annual precip that we have in Fort Collins per year. If you add 10 inches to that, that's 25 inches, okay? So we're looking at Manhattan, Kansas at 31 inches, so you can see it's providing some of the need, but not nearly as much as maybe we're applying. in many cases, people are watering lawns. If they do it to keep the lawn just growing, but maybe not real lush, a little bit stressed, they might be putting down 15 or 18 inches of supplemental irrigation a year. Or if maybe it's keep it really green, it might be 25 inches or so. That's more than a lot of these species need. And a lot of the low water use plants thrive best when they're dry. And we can hurt them when we water them too much. Now this isn't a tree, but I like this picture. This is that plant you see there is a blue elder. Okay, it's a native of Colorado. This picture was taken about 5 miles east of Trinidad. Okay, beautiful big shrub, 10, 12 foot tall. Nice flowers through the summer, purple fruit on it. Has never been irrigated here, growing around some rabbit brush there. You know, when I talk to some of my nursery friends in an organization called Plant Select, I tell them, you ought to be growing this one. This is the one you ought to be growing. And it takes time. They have to put it in production. And there is an organization called Plant Select that picks plants to bring out in the nursery industry and to promote them and to create a market for them. So, but let's look at some of the species that I've put on in this low water use plants. So here's a plant I really like. I always end up bragging a lot about it. Canyon maple. And sometimes these common names, there's more than one. It can also be called big-tooth maple or Wasatch maple. So canyon maple, big-tooth, or Wasatch are all acceptable names. But it only gets about 25 foot tall. It's a low-branched or can be a multi-stemmed plant. Gives good fall color, you can see that. Some people say it's kind of like a western sugar maple. It grows native in the west through a lot of Utah. It's in extreme western Colorado and down into New Mexico. It's very drought tolerant. It can grow in the shade, it can grow in full sun. It likes our soils, which we call alkaline soils, the high pH soils. And it works really well where people tend to plant aspens. And aspens get planted, people like those in Colorado, but they're not adapted to the plains. And I get more insect and disease calls on aspens than almost any other species. So you plant the aspens, maybe they haven't done well and you're ready to do something else, or you've moved to another home, and that entry to your home where you need something where an aspen would have worked, here you go. Low water use, good fall color. Here's the leaf, has the kind of typical maple leaf, not as big as the big sugar maple. And when you buy this, nurseries are starting to carry it. Usually you're going to have to get a smaller plant. Sometimes it's only like in 5-gallon size, and you may only get 3 or 4 feet, but it's starting to be available. So canyon maple. Now here's a new plant on the market. It's called Sensation boxelder. And new in that new products come available in new types of trees. And so we have about a 10 to 15 year history with this cultivar called Sensation boxelder. And so you may be thinking of Sensation's a neat name, but wondering, how about boxelder? Isn't that a bad tree? Well, let me tell you a little bit more. With boxelder, there's male and female trees, and if you've ever had boxelder bugs, anybody raise your hands if you've battled boxelder bugs, okay. All right, don't throw anything at me till you hear that this is a male tree, and it doesn't have seeds, so it doesn't attract the boxelder bug, okay. So we actually have one of our codes in Fort Collins, so you can't sell or plant the seed-bearing boxelder. So you're not going to get the bugs with this. But it's boxelder tough, okay? And it gives some fall color. It'll have a little bit of orange, red fall color. You have to do a little more pruning to it to keep it to a leader. And like all boxelders, if it gets a big wound or big pruning cut on it, it can get some decay. But they're tough trees. And these are starting to be available in the nursery. Here's someone that's used it in a nice xeric landscape and doing really well in this site. I'm sorry I don't have a fall slide of it, but you would get some little bit reddish orange fall color. Now we know boxelder from growing around the native areas and some of the creeks and streams. Here's just a wild boxelder. So we say don't plant seed producing boxelders. You don't want to break the code, but you don't want all those boxelder bugs too, okay? So I'm not recommending just boxelder, but this cultivar called Sensation boxelder. So yeah, and here's just a sprout off one in the spring, and you can see the seeds here. You know, maples have that winged seed, When you break them in two, they flutter down to the ground. So this sort of was off of a female tree, and you can see it's starting to produce the seeds. They have a really green twig to them. So this is a new tree on the market that can grow in very low water use situations. So northern catalpa, the catalpa. So this is a xeric tough tree, and a little bit of supplemental irrigation after establishment. Let me mention a little bit on watering a lot of our broadleaf trees and even our conifers. And we water so much of our landscapes for the lawns because we want to keep them green, so you're putting down regular watering maybe a couple times a week. If you're only trying to water the trees on your lot, well, first off, the more mulch you have, the better. Mulch is a very tree-friendly growth treatment. But the best way to irrigate trees would be during the heat of the summer is like one good soak every 4 or 5 weeks, where you might put down a couple inches of moisture where you're going to soak that top 10 to 12 inches of soil, and then nothing in between. That would satisfy your tree growth very well. But we know in our lawns, if a tree in a lawn, you're going to have to water it more frequently. But if you were just irrigating trees, that would be a recommended frequency and amount there. But northern excuse me?
Once they're established.
Once they're established, thank you. So a very good distinction. If you have a new tree you're planting, you're going to actually even water it more than a lawn, where even in the heat of the summer, maybe every 5th or 6th days, you want to soak that container or soil ball. Yeah. So northern catalpa are really nice for the flowers in the spring. Or in the early summer, in June, you'll find large white flowers on catalpa. It's taller than wide. Often it'll have like a 3-to-1 height to spread ratio. And this is the one that has the long bean pods. So that can be a messy characteristic of it. Though they don't drop all at once, and so that's nice. They're not like just a huge mess all at one time in your yard. And these have the great big leaves, and I've had people refer to these, looks like an elephant's ear. I think that's a pretty good description. And I have fun when I talk about catalpa, because I find in audiences and even professionals that I talk to, some people really like catalpa and some don't. It's got a distinct texture and shape to it. So you're okay if you're in either category. That's really more of an aesthetic call, but it's really drought tolerant. Here's a picture down on College Avenue in a parkway area that gets minimal irrigation. See that nice big mulch ring? So when you're planting your new trees, applying 2 to 3 inches of organic mulch. Don't pile it right up against the trunk. Pull it back from the trunk. Needs to be replenished probably every couple of years. And a great way to conserve moisture in the soil, keep the weeds down, and then you don't have to worry about hitting the tree with a lawnmower or a weed whacker. So catalpa. Now here's a hawthorn, Russian hawthorn. This is a tree that's not native to this continent, native to Russia, but very tough, very xeric, very cold hardy. It's a low spreading tree with usually 3 to 5 stems, much like you see in this picture. Flowers in certain years real heavy white, but it can be kind of an alternate in terms of really heavy flowering. Has a really deep red fruit on it. And for a hawthorn, it doesn't have a lot of really big thorns. Hawthorns have thorns. That's going to be a negative, but they're fairly short and they're not too numerous. But on hawthorns, those of you who are familiar with hawthorns in flower, has anybody had a chance to go up and take a sniff of hawthorn flowers before? I'm kind of looking in the audience to see expressions on faces. They don't smell nice, okay? And you look at a plant like that and you think, boy, that is just beautiful in flower. Now I like trees and the flowers are gorgeous. It's not a terrible odor or anything, but if you get up close, it's just not going to be a real pleasant odor on any of the hawthorns. So here's a couple pictures, one of the trunk on the right. You can see low branched here, and it has kind of a deeply dissected leaf. This tree has an interesting history to our area. It was being experimented with at the Cheyenne Horticulture Experiment Station that closed in 1975, but had been there for several decades and had proven itself to be high plains hardy in Cheyenne. Well, that station closed in 1975, but Colorado horticulturists took note that this species of hawthorn was doing really well up on the high plains of Cheyenne. And now it's in production. You can buy it almost at all nurseries in the Fort Collins area and along the Front Range. But that's unique to this section of the country. If you were looking for Russian hawthorn in other parts of the United States, it wouldn't be available. We've used this tree in our drainage and detention ponds. This is one you can water and get it established, and then with no water it can hang in there. So it's very low water use. Well, honey locust is a tree I bet most of you are familiar with. It's a very common urban tree and probably will be planted more in the future because of some of the problems we're having on ash that I'll mention later in the presentation. But being a xeric tree, honey locust really does its best on the dry side. And you can overwater honey locust and get diseases in the roots and on the stems. Those stem diseases we call canker diseases. But it has a very fine leaflet to it, so it doesn't cast quite as dense a shade. So if you're trying to grow perennials underneath it, or even want a more healthy turf under it, it's not going to cast quite as dense a shade. You can see some of the foliage there on the right picture. All the locusts that are being sold at nurseries today are thornless and podless, but you occasionally will see a pod producing honey locust around, and the big long bean pods that can be quite messy. I've only had one person in my career ask me about finding he wanted to plant a honey locust with pods. He liked that look to it. And apparently the cleaning up of the pods wasn't an issue, but most of the time that would be considered a negative. And if you've ever seen the thorns on wild honey locusts, they could impale you, okay? I've seen a couple heads maybe going up. I mean, they can be 3 or 4 inches long. And if you were an arborist, you would never want to be climbing a honey locust because of those thorns. But nurseries have found these trees that are thornless and podless. There's a cultivar called Skyline and another called Shademaster that are really good. They're tough urban trees that can grow on low water and best kept on the dry side, because when they get a lot of water, there can be problems. Here's a honey locust. You can see the winter silhouette there. Makes a nice canopy shade tree. And I don't know if you can see it in this slide, but sometimes the individual small branches kind of grow in a zigzag kind of pattern. This is out at Spring Park. If you're out in that area, ever walk in that park, you'll see a number of honey locusts. This is a tree probably that's about 35 years old, so fairly fast growing. There can be mature as a big tree of 50, 60 feet tall. And Kentucky coffee tree. This is one that we really should be planting more of when we talk about doing things sustainably, and as that applies to selecting trees. This is a tree with low water needs and low maintenance needs. So it can grow on low water applications. It's one of those broadleaf trees that comes pretty far west into Kansas and Nebraska. Here's a couple on LaPorte Avenue there. When they're small though, probably the biggest limitation we find with people's preference for Kentucky coffee tree isn't that it's xeric or that it's low maintenance, but when it's a small tree, it doesn't have much in terms of a branch architecture or pattern. Maybe a main stem or 1 or 2 arms kind of as a branch, so you have to wait. Wait 10 or 12 years before it develops a nice canopy on it, but it's well worth the wait. There's male and female trees. The one on the left, on your right, on your left there, has the pods. They're not as big and long as honey locust, and has a big compound leaf. Here's one starting to defoliate in the fall. It has some yellow fall color, but you can see that the twigs on honey locust are large and stout. You think of twigs on trees sometimes as being small, the size of a straw. The twigs on Kentucky coffee tree are large. They can be as big as your finger or your thumb there. And here's, you can see some pods on a female tree and the large leaves. So a very xeric tree doesn't require much pruning. Be patient. Best things in life are worth waiting for. but a tree that we could be planting a lot more in Fort Collins, and gets to be 40 to 50 feet tall, but not just mammoth. And when we talk about the size of a tree and the cost of care, I know most of you have probably hired arborists to prune trees, and you find the bigger they are, the more it's going to cost. And you want a canopy shade tree. You want a tree that's going to produce some shade for you on your property, shading your home in a shaded area where you can enjoy on your property. But the bigger it gets, the more you'll cost. So cottonwoods that get huge are going to cost more. So a lot of times more of the medium size, 40 or 50 feet tall, you can get a lot of the benefits without paying as much for the care and the pruning and so forth of trees. And coffee tree fits in that category. Well, one of our natives is American plum. It's almost a shrub sometimes, the shrub thickets that we see around. This is out at Roland Moore Park if you're walking along the walkway there on the south edge of Moore Park. In May, you'll be able to enjoy this clump of American plum there in flower. Very fragrant flowers, and produce a nice edible fruit. And being a native right to the Fort Collins region, this is one after watering to establish, you would never need to water again. But it forms a thicket, so it's very natural in its look. You would have to make your decision whether that fit into your landscape to have more of a thicket kind of native planting. Sometimes people think maybe it's not quite as refined as you'd like for some urban landscapes, but it certainly can go on low water, and in a good year when you can collect the plums, they're very, very tasty. Here's a close-up of the flower. I know the day I took that photo, it was just covered with bees. I can't remember whether I got a bee in that photo or not. So, but very, very fragrant there. So American plum. Now, we've already talked some about bur oak not being native to Colorado, but coming very close to Colorado in its native range, within about 60 miles. And it's just a tough prairie tree. Scientists have found through research that bur oak puts a tremendous amount of its growth energy into its root system. And that's one of the characteristics of xeric trees that allows them to grow on low water where they have extensive root systems. So being a prairie tree, it grows a lot of roots underground and can access a lot more soil moisture. Here's a bur oak on the Colorado State University campus on one of the older sections of the campus near Laurel and College that I think is probably about 120 years old. So it's seen a lot of tough days in Fort Collins when we look back at some of the drought years and some of the very cold periods that we have. And we sometimes think so short into the past to not realize what extremes we've had in climate in the Fort Collins area, just in our short history here where we have climatic data. But I often like to look back to see the coldest day on record in Fort Collins since they kept the weather station at Colorado State University. And it was really cold. It was 41 below zero in 1951. So that is really cold. And we've had these last few winters where we've been down to 12 or 15 below, and we thought those were pretty cold, but you could add another 30 degrees to get to a negative 41. I did have one person in the audience when I was talking about that came up, and I think she had been a student on Colorado A&M at the time. She said, I remember that, and shared that going from building to building, she was covering her mouth just so they wouldn't breathe in that cold. So we've had some very cold days. And we know we get the fall early snowstorms and can have spring limb-breaking snowstorms, the warm up and the cool down in the winter, and drought cycles like we're in. So this tree has seen a lot of weather extremes and a lot of history in our community, but a very tough tree that can grow on just a little bit of supplemental irrigation.
Should you be trimming all those little branches up right there? Oh, that one and the next one. All those little branches beside, are they supposed to be trimmed?
Are you asking if some of those lower sprouts, those lower branches, should be pruned off there? You could do that for aesthetics. A lot of times people will find that to make it look neater with a trunk that doesn't have sprouts or branches on it like that, but it's not doing any harm at all. It does provide some leaf area, so it helps with some of the photosynthesis and so forth. So it's pretty much an aesthetic if you're going to cut some of those lower branches off the trunk here. Here's another look at that big old bur oak and a younger one, just a kid in City Park that's been there probably for about 25 years, putting a lot of roots out underground there. So though it's getting a lot of water in the park for the lawn, it could probably do pretty well with probably 6 to 8 inches of supplemental irrigation applied strategically every month through the summer if we were just watering the trees. But we'd have a very brown park if we did that. So, but it's doing okay there. We don't get a lot of fall color in bur oak. It's pretty much kind of brown to a little bit yellow. And here's a look at another one back over there in Nebraska, eking out a tough existence down in that canyon there, and with no irrigation at all. And the leaf on bur oak makes identification easy. I know as we're talking about these trees and you're trying to learn things about them and how to identify them, this leaf shape, one of the best ways I've heard it described is it kind of looks like a bass fiddle with the big part to the left there and the narrowing to the right. And I don't have a picture of the acorn, but the bur oak acorn has a big fringe on the top of the cap, and it's a big acorn, so that also makes identification easy. Here's another oak, and this is a kind of a newcomer to our urban forest in Fort Collins. It's pronounced chinkapin oak, and it's a little bit difficult to say. I wish in some cases it would have had a name that kind of rolled off your tongue a little easier, because that helps for people to recognize it and for marketing purposes. But it's also a very good xeric oak. Some have really good fall color, as in this example here. And this is an oak that we find over in Nebraska and Kansas, not coming quite as far west as the bur oaks, but can certainly grow on low water applications in our area. Here's the leaf. Now, I just looked at that bur oak and saw kind of the lobing and so forth. This is a little bit of an anomaly because that might not look like an oak leaf to you. And if you happen to know what American chestnut looks like, it looks a lot like a chestnut leaf. And, but it's an oak. It has those serrations on the edge there. And chinkapin oak doesn't get as big and massive as bur oak, and we're not seeing that there's any insects and diseases with it. It does have a broad range to the eastern United States, so your nurseries need to be providing you trees that come from seed sources more in the north. And being an oak, they have acorns. Those are the seed of oak trees there. And wildlife, of course, will devour acorns, but particularly chinkapins because they're a sweet acorn. And so I think squirrels get every acorn in Fort Collins before Christmas, but they'll probably eat these first because they are very, very sweet. The bark is kind of light colored and scaly. So chinkapin, a newer tree to our plantings in the city, and nurseries are starting to care, but a good xeric tree, and you can get some fall color from it. Well, you're probably familiar with Gambel oak. That's our native scrub oak. Doesn't come quite this far north in its native range. About I-70 is as far north as you'll find Gambel oak along the Front Range of Colorado. It does go up into Wyoming north of Steamboat Springs. But we call it scrub oak, but you're looking at that picture, it's a tree or is it a shrub? Both of those are native Gambel oak. And what we've found, and in my interest in oaks and growing a lot and doing what we call testing progeny to kind of figure out genetics, very likely there's more than one species that has formed some hybrids in the past. So it's a little bit of a potluck when you're buying Gambel oak, whether you get one that's more of a shrub or more of a tree, like on the left. But we're familiar with our drives going south on I-25 or I-70, even going west out of Denver, going down towards South Park. You'll see the scrub oaks on the hillside. They form huge colonies, and some become kind of intermediate, kind of smaller clumps or multi-stem trees. This is one of my favorite slides. I think it just says so much about Colorado and the climate. This is at Roxborough State Park there. Some Gambel oak growing right up against some of the red rocks there, and you can see that short grass prairie in the foreground there. But a lot of times it will look multi-stemmed, good dark green foliage, kind of irregular in shape, and maybe spreading and forming a colony. But if you're at a nursery and you're looking at a group of scrub oak and trying to make your selection, if you see one that's kind of shooting up tall, looks like it's got more tree in it, we say that, or more tree genetics, it's probably a better chance that it may end up looking more like the one on the left. And you can see that at kind of a young age. So here's the foliage on Gambel oak, kind of lobed. Get a little bit of fall color on it. And so it's kind of a rough thicket kind of plant, but very, very xeric. Now we've got some really good conifers that are native to our state that have very good drought tolerant characteristics. These first two, unfortunately, are not very available in the nursery trade. The one-seed juniper, you can find it at nurseries, but you'll have to probably shop around and look. This is the one when you get down south of Colorado Springs that you'll start seeing, and down toward Pueblo and Trinidad becomes the dominant juniper in the foothills. And it's all over New Mexico. It's usually kind of multiple stems and kind of that light green color. And this is one you water and get it established. You do your irrigation for 2 to 3 years, and so that the roots that were cut or contained in container have been able to explore out into the surrounding soil, and then you'll never have to water it again, because it does very well in native regions where it only gets 12 or 13 inches of annual precipitation a year. And the Utah juniper, if you've ever driven over to Grand Junction, you haven't seen one, you've seen millions and millions. This is the juniper that is all over the mesas over by the Grand Junction area, literally thousands and millions, if not billions. And it's all over Utah as well. And this picture of the Utah juniper is at the gardens on Spring Creek on the bank. They're right by the parking lot. There's a group of 3 of them. That's one I particularly like because it's kind of got a blue cast to it. There may be a few nurseries that are selling it in Grand Junction, but it's a hard one to find. But you can see the foliage and the seeds on them. They have that scale-like foliage that the junipers have. Those are actually leaves, though they don't really look like it. There's little scales on those twigs. And that's where the green tissue is that carries out the photosynthesis. The Utah juniper has a bigger fruit than the one seed, trying to kind of tell them apart. But the juniper we're familiar with in Fort Collins that's planted heavily is the Rocky Mountain juniper, and it can grow on just very limited irrigation. It's native just west of town. You'll see it as you're hiking up to Horsetooth Rock there. So it's one that needs very little irrigation after establishment. And there's many nursery varieties that we call cultivars of this plant available. So when you go to the nursery and you start seeing names like Colo Green and Moonglow and Gray Gleam, these are all cultivars of Rocky Mountain juniper. And what a cultivar is, it's just a particular plant that the nursery found that they really liked. They thought it had really good color foliage or had a good shape. And then they've taken that and they grow it from cuttings, so then you have clones, identical duplicates. So when you buy it, you know exactly what you're getting, but they would be from Rocky Mountain juniper. In time, they can be kind of irregular and rough looking, like this one over in Grandview Cemetery. It has the berries on them and the scale-like foliage. This is one that, particularly if you live in an older area of Fort Collins, you will sometimes see small junipers coming up underneath big spruce trees, or if you have mulch beds under some shade trees, because the birds will eat them and then they'll drop them underneath where they're perching. And if you don't mow or cultivate that area, it's not uncommon to see some regeneration in urban areas of juniper. So Rocky Mountain juniper, a really good, tough native plant, and a lot of different choices at the nurseries with the different cultivars. So here's the bristlecone pine, native to Colorado, and you'll find it in the Rocky Mountains coming up into Colorado to about I-70. But it doesn't go north of I-70. It's kind of interesting why. I don't have a good explanation of why. The environment in Rocky Mountain National Park is not significantly different than on Mount Evans. Bristlecones are on Mount Evans, but they're not in Rocky. But these are the ancient trees that live so long. Now, our Colorado bristlecones have been dated at about 2,200 years. That's pretty old by my standards. But the California bristlecones are the winners. In Southern California, in the Inyo National Forest, where they've dated the ancient bristlecones, some have been dated still living trees at 4,600 years old. So that is really a long time, okay? So I think they still hold the record as the oldest living tree. Back in Y2K days, you remember when we turned, and I'm a tree guy, but I had a lot of computer friends that were worried about Y2K and what was going to happen. So on January 1st, I had gotten some slides of bristlecone pines together, and I sent out an email, and I titled the email, Y4K compliant, because those trees were 4,000 years old, so they didn't blink with the turn of each millennium there. But they're sometimes called foxtail pine because they are so thick and they hold their needles for so long. Bristlecones aren't a real big pine. About 25 feet would be a big one. Here's that foxtail kind of growth you get on the branch tips. And you can see kind of the white specks on those needles. They have a resin gland that bleeds out just a little bit of pitch, and that's normal. That's not a scale insect or any disease of any kind. That's normal. So bristlecone is a good xeric pine to use, more in scale with some of the small scale lots that we have around Fort Collins, and has more of that irregular shape to it. So a good one that you see some, but we could be planting a lot more of. And then pinyon pine, a native of the southern part of Colorado, and even one outlier population north of Fort Collins. When I say outlier, that's the Owl Canyon pinyons, if you're not familiar with those. An outlier is just a little subpopulation that is not connected to the main population. So pinyon pine is found up along the Front Range to about Colorado Springs. And then we have this little island of pinyons on 287 up by Owl Canyon. So CSU scientists, I believe, have dated those at only about 500 years, so they haven't been there a long time. Another very interesting question, how they got there. And I don't know if there are any really good answers, but that little outlier population there. But pinyon is very, very drought tolerant. Grows in a lot of the same region as that one-seed juniper. It's kind of got the little mound shape to it. It's a good location here, kind of high and dry. You can really overwater pinyon easily. So if you're going to plant a pinyon, it's best to minimal to no irrigation after establishment. It will look its best. And a lot of times these xeric plants, if you water them too much, they grow fast and they don't look good. They get heavy tip growth and kind of bend down and so forth. So unfortunately, there's some insects that are bothering pinyon some that kill the tip growth and get into the trunk some, and even mountain pine beetle. So there are some insect issues with pinyon. And the nuts, everybody's probably enjoyed pinyon nuts. There's another biological question mark that I have with the pinyons that are growing in Fort Collins, and I've almost given up cracking pinyon nuts from pinyons in Fort Collins because they're always hollow, you know. And years ago I thought I'd crack one and I would get to enjoy a pinyon nut, but and I've shared this story with some other plants people, and they say, well, I don't think I've ever found one. I don't have an explanation of why those pinyons that were growing in town don't produce a viable pinyon nut in them, but after a while, I'm not going to crack a tooth if I've finally learned that there's not going to be anything in it. So, but in their native range, they do produce pinyon nuts, which are a nice, very tasty, edible. Another native pine that we have is limber pine. What a perfect name for this tree, because when you go up to the branch, you can just take it and bend it, and you won't break it. You can almost like tie it in a knot. And limber pine grows from about 7,000 feet up to timberline, and I admire it so much because it really likes to grow in really rugged, exposed locations. When you're driving 287 to Laramie, you'll see little groups of pinyons on some of the hill outcroppings. It's almost like they want to be up where it's really tough and dry and windswept. So it can be grown as an urban tree, though compared to a couple others we'll look at in a minute with the Southwest white and the ponderosa, they may not do quite as well. They're one of the pines that have, when you look at pines, the old saying that pines come in packages. So If you look at the base of the needles, they're connected on pines. And so it's a package. And some have 2 needles to a package or cluster, some 3, some have 5. The bristlecone and the limber have 5 needles to a cluster. Here's the cones on them. It has kind of a smooth bark. Unfortunately, as we're having more very serious tree diseases enter our area, there's a disease called white pine blister rust that is attacking and killing limber pine in northern Colorado and up into southern Wyoming. So it's moved into this area, so it is causing a problem in some of the native limber pines there. And we all know ponderosa pine, just west of Fort Collins, grows from about 5,500 feet up to 8,500 to 9,000. A good western pine, very drought tolerant, and though they come in different shapes, and this is a good example of when you're picking a tree for your landscape, the differences in genetics. It can affect other things, even like drought tolerance, but here with shape. So these pines are grown from seed, and so you're going to get some variation on how tall, how wide, those kind of things. So each is going to have its own shape and form. So on ponderosas, a good way to tell them from another common big pine in town, which is Austrian, is you'll see some of that cinnamon or kind of salmon colored bark. Can you kind of see that on that picture on the right there? That's a good way to tell ponderosas, and they'll have 2 or 3 needles to a cluster. And if you pick up one of the pine cones, you're not going to be able to squeeze it very tightly because it has that bristle right on the end of it. So this can be a big pine tree. It can get to be 40 or 50 feet tall. It a lot of times will tend to lose its lower branches because it shades out, but can grow on just minimal supplemental irrigation. So it's a good urban tree for our area. Unfortunately, the mountain pine beetle, which we all know what it's doing, has been devastating in the lodgepole pine forests, is now moving into lower elevations and attacking ponderosa pine. And we're having some urban pines attacked as well. Scotch pine is really the preferred pine for mountain pine beetle that's being attacked in Fort Collins, but some ponderosas are also being attacked. So, and since '08, it doesn't seem to be letting up. And we feel at this point that the bark beetle emergence at higher elevation, a lot of those bark beetles are being blown down over Fort Collins, and then they're seeking out and attacking many of our urban pines. Another kind of newcomer to our urban forest, but a native of Colorado, southwest white pine, and this gets to be a big tree up to 40 or 50 feet tall. Grows more in the southern half of Colorado in the mountains. It has its needles 5 to a cluster, and it kind of resembles the eastern white pine. So if any of you are from the northeast or eastern areas where eastern white pine grows, you no doubt love that tree with the soft needles. This is kind of a look-alike. So eastern white pine is very difficult to grow here, but southwest white pine has good adaptability and good xeric qualities to our area. So location, I sometimes tell people to look for this ad is if you're like me that occasionally stop in at Dairy Queen for ice cream on South College in the summer, and you're sitting on that little ledge there by Creekside Park, there's some southwest white pine growing right on the little hillside there that aren't getting any irrigation at all. So that's a good place to see them, over in that little park right along Spring Park there, southwest white pine. Here's a look at the foliage. It can be kind of a bluish green. It's fairly soft to a touch, and you can almost tell it by its texture there. Maximizing energy savings from shading. Where should trees be planted? And it's kind of an easy thing to remember. The west side is the best. So we're talking about canopy shade trees positioned on your property to provide you benefit on keeping your home cooler and less energy use in air conditioning. So we know that in the winter we have low angle sun that strikes primarily south walls, but in the summer the sun is high, and the issues are mostly the sun striking or radiating the east or west walls. It's hotter in the afternoon. Any shade you can provide to west walls or the west roof is going to give you some benefit in cooling your home. Now, in positioning canopy shade trees, you also have to be thinking about the winter season too, if they get located on the south side of your house, because even when that foliage is off a deciduous tree, it's going to block some of the sun. So summer sun is primarily going to radiate the east and west walls when it's during the summer season. So in this diagram here, you can see that that west wall is shaded, and that it's lightened in color, and so that's where the sun is going to be striking. And so that's where you would want your canopy shade tree located, where you're going to get a significant amount of shading on that side of your house. So electrical use can be highest in the afternoon when it's hot and you want it to be cooler. And I live in a home that is not air conditioned, and I know that the most uncomfortable time, and we open the windows and try to maximize breezing, and I've got a really nice tree on the west side of my property, but it's still those evening hours after it's warmed up in the afternoon is when I'm more inclined to run a fan, or if I had air conditioning, that's when I would be doing it. So electrical use can be highest during the afternoon when temperatures are warmest and incoming sunshine is the greatest. So here's a tree on the west side of the property shading a house in the afternoon.
What kind of tree is that?
That's an oak tree. That's a type of red oak called a Shumard oak. Yeah, yeah, beautiful tree, isn't it? That.
How old is it? I mean, it's huge.
Yeah, this photo was taken in Arvada, and I think it's probably, looking at the house, I'm going to place it probably about 60 to 70 years old, just based on that neighborhood and kind of the way it looked there. So you're not going to get that benefit the first year, are you? You're going to have to wait for it. Forestry is a long-term process, and we're planting for future benefits. So, but you can see here the afternoon shade is being provided on the roof. The west side is the best, and as much of that roof and that west walls that you can shade, the better. Once your home gets hot, then if you start shading it, it's probably not going to do a lot of good once it's already heated up. So earlier in the afternoon, you can get that shading occurring and plant now. Maybe it's going to be for the next homeowner, but they'll appreciate it, that shade that you're providing there. So west is best. So positioning trees to shade as much of the roof and the walls from summer sun as possible. So here's a tree positioned off the west here. Now this was a slide I took recently, so you can see the south wall's actually getting the sun in the winter time. The west wall, which is now shaded in that slide, would be the wall to focus on during the summer season when you want your home to be cooler. So shade tree positioned here. Now, a lot of times you'll get into issues, if you get it a little closer, you'll get shade a little earlier in the afternoon, and you get a canopy hanging up over the house a little bit, but those are issues, how close do you want to be? And your insurer that you have your home insurance with probably doesn't like great big branches hanging all over the top of your house as well. So there's some trade-offs there of keeping trees back 15 to 20 feet usually, though you can go closer, but you can have issues and conflicts with foundations and those kind of things. But a lot of times people, to minimize those, will want to have trees planted back 15 to 20 feet, though it will take longer for the branches to reach that zone. The east side is the second best. So if you get a canopy shade tree on your west side, the east side can provide you some benefit as well from shading the early morning sun on your windows and on your roof. It's not as good as the west, but it can be a beneficial place to place a canopy shade trees over on that east side. Your house isn't going to be warming up as much in the morning, but there is some benefit there. But need to know a little bit about those trees that get planted on the south side of homes, and a lot of times that's just good places to plant for framing your house or street trees, or just would like the beauty in front of your house. But trees that are located to shade the south walls can block the winter sun and increase winter heating costs. So I put some arrows there that are approximate with angles of sun in the summer and the winter. So if you're locating a canopy shade tree on the south side of your house, the research has shown that getting it like 10 to 20 foot away and pruning branches up high is the best tree shape for that particular situation. When you have a tree that's 30 to 40, 50 feet away, and if it's a big canopy tree like this honey locust, it's probably going to be too far away to shade your south walls or your roof with that angle of the summer sun. As that tree gets further away, if you envision that, further away out here, then you wouldn't get any shading on your roof in a situation like that. But in the winter, if it's 30 or 40 feet away, you get a lot of blockage from that south light, okay? So it's a little more challenging to not get a negative benefit from placing canopy shade trees on the side of a house. You can get some gain. It's not going to be nearly as good as west placement. If you have solar panels and you have any kind of significant shading by trees, that's going to really offset any of that benefit at all. If you have a non-solar house and you do have trees about 10 to 20 foot away on your south property and get them pruned up, you can get some benefit. So here's our winter angle sun, much lower on the horizon. So you can see a tree that was planted maybe out here in this zone would be too far away in the summer to cast shade, but if its canopy's up here, it would shade the south roof and south windows there. So getting it fairly close or getting it fairly far away. Now getting it 60 to 80 foot away on a residential lot, that's bigger than most lots, but then it's so far away then it just doesn't have any impact either way. So to maximize summer shade and minimize the winter shade, trees located pretty close. And then you do have issues of how close you want to have a tree to your walls and foundations and things, but research has shown that 10 to 20 feet from the home on a south side would be where it would be most beneficial. But the low branches on this tree can cause winter shade of windows and so forth. So that shape you would want, it's fairly close to the house, would be fairly close, but pruned up pretty high, okay? So if you're trying to get that shape for optimal south exposure benefit. So low branches can be pruned up on that south side of the tree so that you get light from the low angle of the sun coming through. It's fairly close so that in the summer you could get some shading of your roof and your walls there. So it's much more challenging to get benefit there, and this may be more things you would want to think about if you are positioning a canopy shade tree to the south of your property, not to negate a benefit too much, but west is best. West is best. East is second best, and south gets to be fairly challenging there. So there are what we call solar-friendly trees. You probably never heard of a solar-friendly tree. And they basically are ones that just don't cast as dense of shade in the winter. So sometimes there's a little bit of thinking that the foliage is on in the summer. That's great for shading, and if it's off in the winter, then all the sunlight comes through. Well, all the sunlight doesn't come through because of all the branches. So those branches that are real twiggy with a lot of interior growth would be solar unfriendly. Those that are less twiggy and less interior growth that allow more sunlight to come through the canopy would be better choices there. So those would be good ones to look at if that was a factor you're looking at on a south side tree to get better penetration. So some solar unfriendly trees can block a lot of that winter sunlight. You can see the shade pattern here on the grass, so you lose a lot. It can be 50% or more. And there's been some studies done on which species are better in that. Some are less dense and less thick, and so you'd have less of an issue with those. And some are going to block a lot more of that winter light coming through that could be coming in south windows and helping you out with summer passive solar heating there. So here's some solar-friendly trees there that just have a little bit more open canopy there. A couple of these showed up on our xeric trees, the catalpa and the Kentucky coffee tree there. They tend to have pretty open crowns and allow a lot of light to go through. Ash and maple can also be good. One thing I would mention about ash though, and you'll probably be hearing more every year about this dreaded problem in ash in the east called emerald ash borer that is just devastating the ash in the eastern part of the United States and has the potential to kill every ash tree in eastern North America. It's an Asiatic insect that was accidentally introduced into the Detroit area, got a big foothold there, so it's not really controllable anymore, moved into Indiana. It's in Minneapolis and Chicago and Maryland and North Carolina, spreading through the east and just killing millions and millions of ash trees. Our North American ash don't have any past association with it, so they're very susceptible and there aren't any really good bulletproof controls right now. So don't you move firewood, okay? And we're going to have a big campaign, educational campaign in the Forestry Division coming up in the near future, getting information out this. We don't want people moving ash wood into this area because they could introduce this problem into our area. So don't move firewood. If you have any people, friends coming out from the Midwest and they're going to go camping or hunting or fishing, tell them leave all your firewood in Indiana or Michigan or whatever. So ash has some problems out there, and I'm mentioning that in all the presentations that I'm doing. But here you have a Kentucky coffee tree, and you can see that very open crown that would allow you a lot of light coming through there. Okay. So pruning can help improve the solar performance with better light penetration. So here's an ash tree in a park that's been recently pruned. So you can see the canopy has been thinned out. It's been elevated, though there's no building nearby, but you can make the tree serve your solar purposes better through pruning and raising canopies up there. So that can help, okay? So often with homes that are taller or with just issues of potential breakage and maybe some damage to homes, 15 to 20 feet away from a home, planting a major tree is really a prudent distance to be to avoid any conflicts. And sometimes it can be closer. Some people would prefer to be further away. But as the big architecture of that tree grows and moves out more horizontally and limbs that could be out over a roof, a good distance away from the home to avoid those future impacts and make your insurance agent happy to give it plenty of distance there so it can be mature and wouldn't be causing any problems there. So give it some space between your building and your home and where you site that tree. So conifer or evergreen trees can provide some benefit for solar as well on east or west. West is best. They don't have as broad a canopy as some of the big canopy shade trees, so they're not going to cast as big a shadow. So they're a little bit limited there. They do provide some benefit in reducing wind speeds, which we'll talk about next when we in the presentation. But on the south side, they're usually problematic in that they're evergreen, they're going to shade a lot through the winter, so their crowns are kind of narrow, so you're not going to get much summer shading. So you're not going to get much solar benefit from conifers on the south side of a property there. Okay. And to think about too, placement of trees where parked vehicles are. This is a commercial property, but at your home, if you have a place where you're a driveway or parking area where you're parking vehicles outside, planting canopy shade trees that you can park your vehicle under, it will make it more comfortable when you get in. And with the issues of vapors from fuels and so forth, can be reduced by just keeping your car cooler. At my home, I've got 3 maples that I planted years ago across the front and provide some really nice afternoon shade. These trees are now about 25 years old, so people come up and just use my shade. I've seen people eating their lunch, a workman in the neighborhood, and they come in and they're just parking there because after about 1 o'clock or 2 or even about noon, you're getting some good shade, so they're benefiting, by my shade, by stopping and enjoying a moment there where it's not so hot. So consider that. That can be a valuable environmental reason to plant trees. Well, planting trees to reduce wind speeds. There's a publication picture I got from a Colorado State Forest Service document way back, 1980, but a nice photo there of the windbreaks we see out on the plains by farms and ranches to reduce wind speeds and protect crops and cattle. But there's some benefits in our urban areas. We're kind of all working together toward this goal if you live in a residential lot in Fort Collins, because the net benefit of homes and fences and trees create a considerable reduction in wind speeds. But there are opportunities for you if you're on a larger lot to plant maybe some rows of junipers or smaller conifers that can benefit. And there's been some good documented research in some of the upper Midwest states where homes in South Dakota and Nebraska, similar homes, some with windbreaks, some with not, were those with good windbreaks were saving as much as 25% reduction in their winter heating costs with fuel usage. So we know when we slow those winds down, it's going to help us with winter heating, because those winds going by your dwelling is going to be you're going to be leaking and pulling heat out. So basic concept is you got a belt of trees and you are protected from the wind blowing direction. Wind speeds are lower on the downwind or leeward side, and they can be considerably less. And even at 4 times the height of a windbreak, you can still be at 40% of what the open field is. So that band of trees, if you envisioned a row of trees up here that were as tall as the ceiling, they would be breaking that wind a considerable distance, 4 times their height, by breaking it, reducing it by as much as 50%. So here's in the Fort Collins area, this row of spruce trees here. So this leadward distance of wind protection is proportional to the height of the trees. So some of the research that's been done with windbreaks shows that at 4 times the height, 4H, 4 times the height and distance from the windbreak, the wind velocity at 8 feet is 40% less, okay? So that makes it a lot more comfortable when I'm outside, but it also helps you a lot in your winter heating situation. Well, a lot of our lots are small. I live on a fairly small lot, and I don't really have room to plant a row of spruce, but I said we can all work together. Some very interesting research done in California back in the 80s showed that when they took open field wind speeds, and then when homes were built in an area and fences erected and houses, the wind speeds dropped, as you might imagine, because of the houses and the fences. And they dropped by about 1/3 just by having the dwellings, okay, compared to open field speeds. Some years later, when those neighborhoods had achieved about a 40% canopy cover, lots of trees, the wind speeds had dropped another 30%, okay? So just the houses, fences and so forth, they're going to reduce wind speeds. But the vegetation that I have and you have and your neighbors have, if you're living in a more mature neighborhood, is going to take off another 20 to 30% of open field wind speeds. So I was checking the wind speeds last night. Being a city forester, you're worried about trees breaking and falling, and it's kind of hard to go to sleep with the roof rattling and all that. But a lot of times I'll check the Colorado State University station by the Student Center, and then they have a station out west by Chrisman Field, which is west LaPorte, almost to the treatment plant out there. And when I was looking at it about 10 o'clock last night, there was about a 30-mile-an-hour difference in the gusts and the wind speeds over that about 3 or 4 miles. Now I know it is heavier as you go further west, but a lot of those trees and homes and dwellings were breaking that wind speed down. So your neighbor's trees are benefiting you by keeping that wind speed down some. So you're helping everybody as you plant your component of the urban forest on your property. So this is a really neat picture. You think of hedges as not being very tall. That's a pretty impressive hedge, isn't it? Yeah. This is by a nursery just north of Fort Collins up off I-25, and they actually have a sign there. And when I went out to photograph that, because I guess a lot of people are curious, they have the date it was planted and the type of juniper. It was planted in 1976, and 3 to 4 foot kind of centers. That's the space between these Rocky Mountain junipers, and I think they were that cultivar called Gray Gleam, and they shear it every year and do a meticulous job. Now that's no easy job shearing that, is there? Is it? You know, the ladders and precision and all that. But that's almost a world champion hedge there, but they're getting some really nice wind protection for their tree crops that they're growing there. And so if you're thinking of wind speed reductions 4 times the height, and even you can even 10, 20 times the distance of the height, still getting some wind speed reduction. And this is on the west side of their tree farm there. You're getting a lot of good benefit, that. And it's only, I didn't measure the width, I think it's only 10 or 12 foot wide. So you could have that right on the boundary of your house. But it would take a lot of work to shear that and all that. I know I get questions a lot of times also, maybe you were thinking about some of these, about vegetation and noise reduction. And because we maybe are closer to a road than we like, or there's a source of noise that annoys us, but vegetation doesn't do a very good job with noise reduction. Solid fences or earth berms are much better than vegetation. It's great for out of sight, out of mind, and that's almost a solution, because when you can't see the noise source, you sometimes don't tend to hear it. And so much of our interpretation of whether noise is annoying or not is if we think it's appropriate. That's an interesting psychological thing too. I'm kind of deviating a little bit here. I always use the example, if you're eating lunch in downtown Fort Collins out on one of the sidewalk cafes, do the cars going by annoy you or bother you? Probably not too much, but if you're hiking up in the wilderness area and you might hear somebody with a radio or a voice just in the softly in the distance, I tend to get annoyed by that because I don't want to hear anything. So a lot of times it's the setting that we hear it or the setting that we see it, and if we don't see it, we're not thinking about it, so it's a little bit out of sight, out of mind there. So we see windbreaks and planted with multiple rows, sometimes with shrubs and layers. It gives a little better density. Sometimes they're planted for visual screens and noise buffers, though they're not probably real effective for noise. If you have an acreage, you can look at multiple layers, and there's a lot of information available through the Colorado State Forest Service. And their Colorado State Forest Service nursery, if you're a landowner of a certain acreage and you use the trees for conservation purposes, which is windbreaks, shelter belts, or growing for Christmas trees, they provide landowners there's a cost associated. You can get seedling trees to plant in those particular situations through the Colorado State Forest Service. And you might not know what this is, but I bet you've all seen it out by Hughes Stadium, the rows of junipers. Have you ever noticed those? If you're a Ram fan going out to the game there, and that row of junipers right along Overland Trail. I'm standing in the Hughes Stadium entry, the parking lot there, a long row of junipers on there, and maybe you thought, well, maybe that's just a windbreak, but that was planted there as a living snow fence. And trees can be used for that purpose also, where you get drifting snow. They have to be spaced back a considerable distance, usually at least 100 feet from the road, because right in back of the shelter belt, you get a lot of drifting of snow. But that's what that was. It was mentioned in an article in the paper this last weekend. They were talking about their seedling trees and mentioned the living snow fence out there at Hughes Stadium. So next time you're going to a game or driving by there, it's a nice kind of visual row of juniper and pine there, but it was planted there specifically as a living snow fence, and it's set back a considerable distance from the road. If you're driving to Sterling on 14, you'll see places where you'll see the trees and shrubs planted back from the highway a certain distance in there, and those have also been planted as living snow fences in those particular areas to keep the drifting of the snow over the highway there. Okay. So if you have solar panels or active solar systems on your properties, or anticipating to do that, you don't want to have tree conflicts. You want to harvest as much of that sunlight as you can and have the trees get their share as well, but not to come in conflict. So here is a new development in Fort Collins out on Vine Street that just opened recently, and they've got several solar panels across the front of the property. So one of the design decisions on this property was to be sure and use trees that weren't going to get too tall. So this small tree in the foreground, planted as a street tree, is on the south side of the panels there. And when I was reviewing plans, they had some interaction that yeah, we're going to have solar panels, and if we have 60-foot trees, that's not going to work very well. So picking the right kind of tree to get on, particularly south of your solar panels, so you're not going to have those issues, is important. So basically you need a short tree, don't you? And a lot of times under 12 to 14 feet, and you can do your sun angles and so forth. So here's a few to be thinking about if you need some low profile trees that are going to be really solar friendly and not be blocking your panels. The service berries are good. 12 feet is usually about maximum height, good flower, and kind of moderate water use for a lot of them, multi-stem, but they're a good choice that aren't going to get up very high at all. So service berry. This thornless cockspur hawthorn, those are, first two names are kind of in conflict with each other because it's thornless, but a cockspur, you know, is really a long thorn. The wild trees do have really long thorns, but nurseries found one without thorns, so it's thornless cockspur, but good flowers in the spring, nice fruit. 12 to 15 feet would be pretty much maximum. They do spread quite a bit, about a 12-foot spread. Nice, really polished foliage, good fall color, a good urban tree that could be sited near solar panels. Coral burst crabapple, this is one that will stay short as well, about 12 feet. This is a winter scene, obviously, but it does have nice flower in the spring and not much fruit, but kind of has that thick growth. It's actually grafted on a stem. They call it a high graft, and then it's the part that's so bushy is a graft above. But coral burst crabapple is a good one, and to use in situations where you're going to need something that isn't too tall. And Japanese tree lilac, another choice. This is a nice June flowering tree. You might think lilacs are those that are shrubs with the lavender flowers that smell so nice. There are tree lilacs, and these bloom a little later than the shrub lilacs, and they have the white flowers. They're very sweet. It's a little different than the lilac smell. It's a sweet smell, but can be maintained with a little bit of pruning at 15 feet. They'll get a little bit bigger in some cases. So those are some tree choices that you can consider if you're designing in solar panels and don't want anything too tall, or maybe just have a situation where you're looking for some trees that aren't going to get quite as tall. So you already seen my oaks there on the shrub live oak. It would actually work pretty well too. It's only going to get about 12 feet and neat leaf. Been hard to call that an oak without seeing that acorn cap there, wouldn't it? Yeah. Those of you who got those, you'll enjoy those, particularly in November and December until we go down to about 0, because they'll stay evergreen. And I would ask too those that did take one, if I could just get your name too and maybe contact information. I sometimes just like to stay in touch with people on how my oaks are doing. If you would be inclined to do that, I'd just like to get a name and a contact. I'd appreciate that, the 4 of you. So here they are down in Phantom Canyon. You know, I'll tell you a little side story. We're just almost at the end here. I guess we've got a couple minutes. When I was down collecting seed for those oaks that those of you got this evening, I think I collected those in 08, and then I planted them in 09, and then they're 2 years old. But I got down there to Phantom Canyon in the morning, and it's kind of a remote area, and there was this pack of what I thought to be just some wild dogs, some feral dogs, you know, and they get to run as a pack. So I wanted to get my acorns, you know, because I show up there about the first week of August, but here was this pack of dogs, and I thought, well, boy, I really want to go up the hillside a little bit. It's public land there, and collect some seed, but boy, those dogs really, you know, I started up there and I wanted to bark at me. There were 7 or 8 of them there, so I had to wait until they moved. I kind of lingered around and they kind of took off. So I've given that strain of shrub live oaks a cultivar name. A cultivar name is just anybody who wants to really assign a name. I sent a couple, 3 of these to a friend in Illinois just last week who's an oak enthusiast, but the name I gave him is Wild Dog. So that's, they're Wild Dog Shrub Live Oaks. So that's kind of the cultivar name. So kind of an interesting story. But they cleared out. I got my seeds. They were happy, and they didn't get me for breakfast there. So that brings us to the end. I know we'll have some time for questions here. I'll be glad to take those. You've got my email. I wouldn't mind at all if you do email me. Just make be sure and put a title on it, something about trees. And this is one of my favorite pictures. This is a Colorado picture, and this is also a type of oak. It's called a wavy leaf oak growing down there in southeast Colorado. Beautiful fall color. I took this picture about the 1st of November in '06, growing right out of the rocks. And when we think of our landscapes that we're trying to create in our urban areas with low water, sustainable and attractive, that does it all. And when we can incorporate those elements of nature in their most natural way, it works the very best. So I would love to see more landscapes that look just like that in Fort Collins that would use less water and less maintenance and be very sustainable. So thank you very much, and I'll be glad to take some questions. Yeah, the question was on fruit trees. I only had the American plum, and we were talking about low water use. One I really could have included, and as you mentioned that, I thought, yeah, that could have gone on. Apricots are very drought tolerant trees and go in very low water. They flower so early, you don't always get a fruit crop. But of the fruit trees, they're very low water use. The sour cherries are as well. They can grow in some pretty low water situations. So varieties like North Star or Montmorency are cultivars of sour cherries. Those are good fruit trees that you can grow. Yes? The question was, of the trees that I presented, which develop a canopy, maybe have a more rapid growth? Honey locust is pretty fast growing there. Catalpa has pretty good growth as well. Oaks are kind of moderate. The Chinkapin oak is going to grow faster than the bur oak. Of the evergreens, ponderosa pine is a fairly fast growing, and southwest white pine would be faster growing of those. Yes? Yeah, the question was, could I speak a little bit about hot wings Tatarian maple? And boy, it's getting a lot of interest. That's a type of ornamental maple, and it's a very good maple. I didn't include it on the list, but it can grow on moderate to low water and doesn't get too big, about 25 feet, spreads maybe about 15 to 20, and can prune it up to a single stem or can be multi-stem, has pretty good fall color. But the reason that hot wings is so nice is those seeds, the maple seeds that kind of look like a horseshoe, turn a real red for about 5 or 6 weeks in the early part of the summer, and it just looks like it's in flower. It looks like it has red flowers on it. So it's good cold hardy, fairly low water use, no insect and disease problems. You get a little bit of fall color. So it's a really good ornamental. I'm real impressed with it, yeah. The question was whether sweet gum, and you used the scientific name liquidambar, which is the genus of sweet gum, and I don't know, it's kind of a cool generic name, but it's a tough one in that our soils are alkaline and not acidic, and a little too cold here. There is a nice one down on Parkway Tree over on Mountain Avenue that's on the Color Tree Coalition champion tree list, but there's only 2 or 3 that I'm aware of. Very, very tough one to grow here, the sweet gums, yeah. So the question was, when you plant a tree, whether you can create a channel for watering with a pipe of some kind by putting it, you'd want to put it outside of the container or soil ball so you don't put it into the root system. And by placing that down with gravel or something, then you can put water in it to get a deeper watering. I've seen that recommended only in situations where it's really hard to get a concentration of water, enough of it right above the planting. So if you can build like a saucer or something, that takes care of it. Or if you have drip, that takes care of it. But if it's going to be really difficult to get the water down deep, I've seen that detail used in planting pits like in sidewalks and things. So it is recommended in special situations, not as just a common practice like that. Good luck with your water and energy efficient tree choices. So thank you very much.